We're going to talk about the wiring now, but I wanted to mention that this is an LS3, so if you guys are watching this install video and you're putting a truck engine in your JK, while very similar, it is a little bit different than this, and we're going to try to do a truck build also so we can show you the differences. So let's get into the heart of the build and the part that most guys have questions on, which is the wiring. There's basically two wiring areas we're going to deal with. One is the GM side and one is the Chrysler side. So let's start with laying the wiring out on this LS3. Now I'm going to basically identify the major components of this wiring harness, and we're going to put all the wiring on top of this intake to drop the body, which should hopefully happen today, and then we're going to spread it back out and hook everything up. So let's start with the GM harness. Here's your main GM harness. Let's start here. These are your E38 ECM connectors. The ECM is going to be on this left driver fender well, so we're going to leave those right about there. Here's your Bussmann fuse block. This is the GM fuse block. It's weather pack sealed. You got your fuel pump and your powertrain control relay. All these fuses control the same circuits that a factory GM truck SUV does, meaning it's the same amperage, the same color wires. If a tech were to have to identify a problem, he could use the GM service manual, and these fuses, we can give you a legend of what each one of these fuses do. All these fuses will be hot with the key on. Only these two lower right yellow fuses will be hot with the key off. Those are to save your adaptives and for other various reasons like the prindle control. So when you check fuses, don't just pull them out and look at the fuse. Use a voltmeter or test light on both sides of the fuse with the key on. That will tell you if there's voltage there. You could have a fuse that looks good visually, but there's no voltage going to it. So check that. This is the cover for the fuse block, which we'll install later. I like to run an Adele clamp here on this alternator bracket to hold the harness up off the engine. Not required, but something I prefer to do. Now this is an LS3, so this is a very low intake. On the trucks, you will see a molded in Y right at the top of the intake, and you can see this Y here in our harness mimics that Y. So this Y essentially goes right about in the center of the intake. If you have that there, that is your starting point. All your links are going to be correct on this side and on the passenger side. So starting from that Y, here's what we have. This first breakout is going to be the interior harness. Now, coming down this harness, there's a 4-pin flat Molex connector. Do not use this current. If you're doing this build and it's a non-Generation 3 kit, tape this off. We do not need this connector. This is some sensor inputs for our next generation kit. Coming down this harness again, you have two 15-pin connectors. Now again, you are not going to use this 15-pin connector. This 15-pin connector, look at those colors, is for future use. This again is we are actually eliminating the C100 harness, the Chrysler engine harness, and this is part of that sensor feedback. So go ahead and tape that off. This is the only connector we're going to be using into the interior. This does your accelerator pedal, check engine light, all sorts of stuff. So that is going to be run through the hole next to the power brake booster, and we'll show you that when we get the body on, and that's going to connect into your interior harness. So this is basically a firewall connector that can be disconnected to pull the body off. So let's take a look at this side of the engine. We have 4 injectors, and you'll notice that the number 1 injector breaks off on its own harness. Make sure you get these right. Don't swap these around. I've seen guys do that. A good starting point is this ground connector. You notice we use a heavy duty lug, and I want to say something about grounds. Grounds are really important in these swaps. So I'm going to try to zoom in here a little. We're using a 10mm bolt. We have a heavy duty lug that we supply on our harness. We're using a flat washer on the top and a crushed star washer on the bottom between the block, or in this case the head, and the ring eyelet. That gives you a really good ground that's not going to let go. Don't just put a bolt on there without the star washer if you can help it. I like to always ground. There's going to be two main grounds on this LS harness: driver side, passenger side. I always like to ground right next to the coolant temp sensor. If you do that, then the wiring harness will lay out properly. I have guys mount this on the rear, and then you end up flipping the injectors over. A good rule of thumb is to know, and this is true on almost all LS engines, that the number 3 injector, which is this one, is going to be pink and pink. So that way you'll know if you have it flipped over. You notice Ronnie mounted the purge valve up here in the rail as we discussed earlier, and you're going to basically just plug that in. That's pretty simple. Then you have all your injectors. You have your coil connector on this side. We'll of course clean this up a little bit, but that's all your connectors on your driver's side. Ronnie has got the purge. This is your fuel line, and this is your purge line. Now he has covered these with split loom, which I recommend, and they come straight back to the fuel tank. Now this is important. Look at these molded in connectors in the fuel tank. I do not recommend you run those. When these are snapped in there, it pulls this harness down and the exhaust runs right through here. Now this is not just true in an LS, but if you're doing a Hemi or a 3.8, Chrysler has problems with these plastic lines melting with the exhaust. So pop them out of the holder. Bring them up over the fuel tank skid plate, over to the transfer case adapter. Now, I want to say, some guys want to tie these down every 6 inches. Don't do that. In the old days, we tied them down a lot. You want these to be able to move. You want to have abrasion protection on here and maybe loosely tie them with some clamps, but let them float, because when you're off-road and you're shaking around, it's better to let these move than not. So pull the fuel lines over, bring them up to the transfer case, straight up. Fuel line, this is an LS3, so it has a 90-degree connector on it. If this was a truck, it would be straight, and it would come into the back of the fuel rail right here, and then your purge valve. Purge valve's plugged in, and the front of the purge valve is your vacuum source, which I showed you in the previous video. Let's move over here, and you will see this LS harness comes back off the Y, and we have our oil pressure sensor. This is the large oil pressure sensor they've run since 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. If you have an earlier engine, a 7 or an 8, put this sensor on, it'll plug right in. Excuse me. This vehicle does not have air fuel management. There would be a connector here if it did, but since it doesn't, we're just going to tape that off, which actually my guys have already done, so the connector's not even here. Go ahead and put your brake vacuum line on. You can see Ronnie is using some new 3/8 vacuum line, and it's quite long right now. This is your original Jeep one-way check valve. If you have a newer JK with a brake booster vacuum sensor, you're going to see a little 3-wire sensor coming off this. That's what controls the vacuum pump that's in your front bumper. But on the earlier JKs, this is all you're going to have is a simple one-way check valve. But go ahead and plug that in now, because it's easier than when the body's on. On the trucks, there's going to be a fitting sticking straight back, and it has a little red release tab. You're going to make sure that fitting's in there. If it's not, get one from your dealer, plug it in, then plug your hose into that. So that pretty much takes care of the back side of this engine. Let's go to the other side. This side has a little more going on, but here's our Y. Remember, everything is indexed off this Y. Now, we're going to come up here to this first brake. Pretty simple. This is your coil connector to snap that right in. And then you've got your injectors, and again, we've laid this out so the front injector, which happens to be 2 in this case, has its own little harness, and then the other 3 are a log. And you're just going to go 2, 4, 6, 8. This transmission dipstick tube, you can see the stud that we talked about earlier, how it spaces it slightly away from the bell housing. That allows this green hat seal to stay in securely. And we have our transfer case transmission vent line coming up with our little shield or cap at the end. And that's pretty much the passenger side rear. Now on the passenger side front, we have, this is our MAF sensor. And the LS3 MAF sensor, this is our color of wiring. Yellow to the right is our signal, black is ground, the center pin is pink, which is 12-volt power, and then these two, brown and tan, are your intake air temp sensor. So if you do change the MAF sensor, like in California we have to run a different MAF sensor, they could be pinned differently, but for the standard LS3 blade style MAF, this is going to be your pin out. Now this is going to plug right into the air intake tube, which is not on, so we're not going to plug that in right now. Here's where I suggest you put your passenger side ground. Again, it's a heavy duty lug with heat shrink that we supplied, and there's a star washer and a flat washer on that. Get it real nice and tight. These, I cannot stress how important these grounds are. If you do not have these grounded properly, let's say you grounded this to the valve cover. Now the valve cover is isolated through rubber, through the gasket. This is not a good ground source. You could throw the engine into a reduced power mode. The grounds feed the computer a good low reference. Low reference is ground that's supplied by a computer. So if this is a weak ground, the computer is not going to put a good low reference out. This is the, excuse me, this is the throttle body connector. This is probably the most important connector in the entire vehicle. GM only recommends that you plug this in a couple of times before you replace it. This is a very sensitive connector, and essentially GM provides a 5-volt power source for 2 throttle position sensors, and they use 2 sensors that work in opposite directions, low to high, high to low. So if you were to get a weak ground, those signals would spread apart and put you into a reduced power mode. And GM actually had a problem with that in the early days of the Gen 4 motors and beefed up the grounds. So now we have multiple grounds in multiple positions. Never ground anything to the valve cover. Always go to the block or the head. The main ground for from your battery is going to go down to the block by the starter motor. You want that to be near the starter motor, so when you crank it, you have all the available amperage to it that you can get. But we'll talk about that when we after we get the body on. So here's your main ground for the passenger side: throttle body connector, MAF sensor connector, and MAP. MAP is your manifold air absolute pressure, MAP. This tells you intake manifold vacuum, and this connector has been the same. This is a Bosch sensor since 2009. In 7 and 8 they ran a Delco sensor, and the calibrations are different to accommodate the Delco sensor. So if you have a 7 or 8, this sensor will have to be replaced or changed out to work with the Delco sensor, which happens to have the same connector as the crankshaft position sensor. But for right now, this is a Bosch sensor. All LS3s run this, and all the truck engines run this from 9 up. So always use dielectric grease on all your connectors. Put the grease in the female side of the connector and then install it. That's good to keep moisture out and keep corrosion away. So that's pretty much the wiring on the passenger side. Now let's go to the front, and this is probably the most complicated part. So we have our harness coming down from, here's our Y, I'll never forget our Y, and we have this breakout here that's going to go behind the alternator. It's going to come down and it's going to break off into a couple of branches. Okay, first is our ground, as we already discussed. Second is going to be our coolant temp sensor. This is your GM coolant temp sensor, and you might want to check these. GM did have a problem on some LS3s where they weren't tightened properly and they leaked, so you might want to pull it off and double check it. This is going to be, this wire here is going to come down. It's going to do our knock sensors, crank sensor, and cam sensor. So I already explained that our cam sensor comes right off. It drops down here, and we don't have these hooked up yet. This leg, this is the knock sensor for the driver's side, which we will run along the oil pan and plug in once the vehicle's in the air. And then this leg that has the two connectors. This is your knock sensor for the passenger side. This is your crankshaft position sensor. Notice there's already dielectric grease on it. That's going to plug in behind the starter motor. So make sure that you plug this in before you put the starter motor on. It's a lot easier. So we're gonna connect that too after the vehicle's in the air. Let's go to the other side and check out the rear connections. All right, so if we follow our Y down, we got our oil pressure sensor, no AFM, DOD, MDS, whatever you want to call it, sensor connector. That's been terminated right here by my guys. We will seal that, and there's no reason to have the connector hanging out. So here's a question I get a lot, and I'm hoping that this video is going to answer. Oxygen sensors. We have two upstream oxygen sensors and two downstream oxygen sensors. Now let's take a look at this. If you follow this harness down, the first sensor you're going to run into is an upstream oxygen sensor. Come down the harness a little further, and there's another oxygen sensor connector. Now you'll notice that these two are the same because they're both upstream. On all of our harnesses, irregardless of the chassis, whether it's a TJ, JK, Chevy truck, whichever sensor breaks out first is always the driver's side. So this is going to be bank 1, sensor 1, B1, S1. Driver's side in the Chevrolet is B1. S1 means sensor 1. S2 means sensor 2. So this is B1, S1. This second one down is going to be B2, S1. That's bank 2, sensor 1. Bank 2 is always passenger side. So that's going to indicate passenger side upstream. Come down the harness, and the first connector you come to is going to be bank 1, sensor 2, B1, S2. And you'll see that this is the opposite connector, so you know that's a downstream. Come down a little bit further, and here's our, let's get this one out of the way, and here's our downstream bank 2. So this is B2, S2, bank 2, sensor 2. So remember, whichever one breaks out further forward is always the driver's side. We've got a vent here for the transmission that tees off, comes back to the vent for the transfer case. So when we get the transfer case on, we'll show you how we hook that up. And then we got our fuel lines coming down, along with this wire, which comes off the LS harness, comes all the way back. Remember, we're going to install a closed loop feedback EVAP system on this. So this wire comes back right into our fuel tank pressure sensor. Now this is the line that comes off the fuel tank that vents the fuel filler neck. You notice that he cut out a couple inches, put the T in that's already provided for you, plug in this 3-wire sensor. This is going to give the GM computer the fuel tank pressure in the system so it can decide whether to purge, vent, or do nothing. So that's the first connector. Second connector comes off is the vent solenoid, and I think we talked about that. The vent solenoid is going to go into the original Jeep vent line. Now you can run it right off the canister if you want. Ronnie decided to put it here. It really doesn't matter. This just seals the fuel system. When it needs to vent, the GM computer will turn it on. An interesting note is that this sensor is powered all the time. If you were to fill your Jeep up with gas on a hot day, the GM computer is smart enough to know if the fuel tank pressure builds up, and rather than blow off the fuel cap, or when you pull the cap off, get a face full of vapors, it will actually vent the system for you. So that pretty much takes care of the LS harness. We're going to do the Jeep harness next, and then we'll talk about the transfer case adapter.